Let's sing glory! Okay, I have just recorded this in 3 different rooms. I'm helping my mom move house, and we have, I don't know, it seems like the more boxes that get removed from a room, the echoier it becomes. Okay, today we're sitting down with artist, singer, sustainability advocate, and model Rachel Rutt. Speaking to her individuality, Rachel brings together this understanding and curiosity, traversing various expressions that seek to delineate connectivity, community, and consciousness. Speaking to her overall message, it's to do more. Her work within the artisanal crafts, such as weaving, knitting, and embroidery, paired with a background in the fashion industry as a model, has her straddled between generations both young and old. Advocating ethicality, sustainability, and a shift towards the slow movement, she's allowed for these to naturally take place within her own pursuits. Touching on that perhaps rather than the individual artist with a singular vision, we're undergoing experiences and creating as a collective people, synchronously addressing and connecting on a level unbeknownst to us. Still in awe and feeling like I barely even grazed the surface on all that this lady knows and does. This is This Fiber Journey with Rachel Rutt. A quick heads up, we're dealing with an overseas conversation here, so the audio may reflect this. Coming to you from Sydney, Australia, and Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Going through your bio beforehand, and I'll link all the platforms in the show notes of the episode for all the listeners, it shows that you are really varied in your work, and all with the underlying theme of sustainability and the embrace of the slow movement. And just doubling back to square one, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and say if you were asked by someone on the street at random about what you do, how you would best answer that in blunt terms?
Okay, this is a great question because I feel like I actually have to battle this all the time. So I generally say that I'm an artist because I feel like that's a word that not only everyone accepts as being this sort of mythical profession where, we don't, it can be a lot of different things. So I like to say artist, but basically, yeah, I'm an artist working with textiles and with sustainability initiatives and also in music. So that's how I sum myself up, I guess.
And kind of like, what's your relationship like with your gut? And was it always a surefire thing that you wanted to work within this space or these spaces? But how did you kind of go about navigating your purpose?
So I think for me personally, I kind of know the way that life happens to me a little bit, if that makes any sense. So it's not so much that I've always had a certain vision that was very clear to myself in plain words. It was very much about how everything for me is very feeling based. And when it came to making art and creating in general with others or alone, the thing that I find the most confidence from and navigational is sort of how it begins or how it happens to me. So the way that a lot of the best things in my life happen are seemingly accidental, but overall very intentional from the moment that they enter my life and my awareness. So a lot of the things I do, I would never have thought I would have done before I got into them. It's just that for some reason or other, they entered my life at the right time, and it's partially me taking a chance on them, but it's also that when things enter my life in a certain way, usually through a positive interaction, and then subsequently things seem to happen very quickly after that, it sort of builds a momentum for me. And obviously if I'm drawn to it, it seems to just take place. And because that similar momentum has happened with multiple things in my life, I trust that as usually boding really well. And maybe that's my version of the gut when it comes to my career.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely you've got a hand in almost manifesting. Do you intentionally manifest, and do you believe in the concept of manifestation?
Yes, I do. I really believe that if you write something down, for instance, or you say it out loud, it usually happens really quickly afterward. Even if at the time you're feeling like it's impossible or the opposite's going to happen. It definitely has happened time and again for me. And I've definitely been at the top of the world and at the bottom of the world when certain things have happened in that way. It's not just when things are rolling really well that you get a positive manifestation, or you can also get negative manifestations too, but I try and avoid those.
So we all.
Yeah.
But say when you have kind of a light bulb moment and you really want to go after this idea or something that you just really want to manifest, do you have, say, a ritual that you follow? Do you sit down and journal? Do you mind map? Do you have anything you kind of turn to? Or is it just all in the mind and you're just like, I'm just going to intentionally keep this thought with me and it will work out?
It's partially what you said, where you're holding it intention in your heart, but I also talk to my friends and my partner, my collaborators. I talk to people who know me best. I'm really lucky to basically have friends who are all creating as well, and we create together very often. And it's also very friendship based. It's not just professional. So I might have met a lot of them professionally and they became friends, or vice versa. So I'm really lucky to have a trust network with my close friends where when we have ideas, we not only talk about them and workshop them, but we often contribute to each other's plans. So that is usually the first port of call for me, other than inside of myself. I immediately will try and get feedback. Once I think an idea through, I'll ask people and talk to them about it, because often I learned this the hard way of like holding ideas in, because I was almost scared at one point to share them, and also firstly scared of what other people might think, but also scared of my own ability to act on them. And also at one point, I think sometimes you get afraid that someone else might even steal your idea, and that sounds bad, but sometimes you do think like that. And then there came a point in my life when that was happening, where I realized that because I wasn't talking about them or sharing them, they never happened. So in a way, even though I was trying to save it for myself, it doesn't really work like that. Because I also think that ideas, if they're happening to you, you might feel like they're absolutely unique to you. And as artists, I think we all want to think that we're absolutely individual and completely unique. But I also believe in this thing that the same idea, when it's ready to happen in the world, it will happen to multiple people around the world at the same time. And you have to act on those ideas, not just because someone else might do them first, but because the world is ready for them. And in the idea space, we're all sharing a collective consciousness that maybe not all of us are aware of. And we might not even know each other in real life or know of each other in real life. And we could be having the same idea at a similar moment in time.
I love that you've kind of taken this perspective of we're all connected, and that us as a people will be introduced to a concept or go through an experience when we are ready for it. Focusing on your woven work and just this work that you integrated with like fabrics and textiles and also organic matter, I'd love to know how you source your materials and if there are any hurdles in acquiring your supplies.
So basically, when I started making things with my hands with fiber, it started off with knitting, which is very hands-on and very universal. People have it in their homes. It's like it's a common thing to see around. It's something we all have memories of. We're all kind of connected to it, even if we've never done it before. And through that process, I learned how to weave, and I did that in a much more, not academic, but in a structured kind of scholastic area. I went to a guild and I studied it with artisan masters, and the way that it's taught is much more mathematical. And it kind of trained me to kind of look at it from a very structural point of view as opposed to a creative point of view. And those few years of studying that, and also the first few years of applying it into my own practice, really changed the way I created. And for a while, actually, it was quite stunting for me. But basically, to answer your question, through learning how to make things with my hands, I started wanting to know from the ground up how these things were evolving. So you're working with fiber, but fiber is a very tactile thing. Where does that fiber come from? It's either plant-based or animal-based, or sometimes it can be, man-made fiber, but not really when it comes to hand making. It's usually plant or animal. And so I learned how to spin fiber. I'm not very good at it, but I learned how to do that just to kind of get a basic feel for where these things were coming from. In my work, I use a lot of silk and linen and cotton. And I think personally, I just like the way that they appear once they're kind of put together. But when sourcing it, I guess like I try and source a lot of things locally, but in Australia we don't grow as much of these fibers locally anymore. For instance, I recently learned that pre-World War II we had a lot of linen and flax farms here, but now it's not available anymore. The best linen tends to come from Europe, but or flax. But it's interesting. Like there's certain things that you actually just can't get where I live, so it's sort of a balance of one thing or another, and just basically trying to get quality fibers. But the relationships that delving into the fiber world have provided me with wool farmers, for instance, because I use a lot of wool is one of the fibers that we can get very abundantly here in Australia. And the relationships that I've built with wool farmers who sell, to makers, it has been incredible. It's been very educational. And it's a generation that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to breach, being in my 20s, and it's an older generation, and a lot of them, if you meet them in another context, they kind of look at you as somebody's daughter or granddaughter. They don't see you as a peer, but because of mutual interest in the fiber arts, you have this immediate bridge, and I think that's been one of the most rewarding things about my fiber journey, I would say.
Your fiber journey? I love how you refer to that.
I don't know how to explain
it. Have you found that there are other people within the younger generations that are reaching out to older generations through kind of the avenue that you're exploring as well? Is there more interest, or do you find that you're the only one in your area?
So when I studied at the Guild, there was a huge generation gap. I was the youngest person. There were a few other young people there, but mainly there were women that were retired, one man as well, but mainly women. And they were all retired between the ages of like mid-50s and up. A few random other ages, but mainly mid-50s and onward. And so they were really excited to have a few young people on board, because for some reason here anyway, it's really skipped a generation. I don't think it's like that in different countries abroad, but in Australia, handmaking and things like that has sort of died out, like local trade. A lot of our fashion industry and consumption is based on importing. So a lot of the local artisans who used to be able to teach at colleges and things like that, they don't have those opportunities anymore. And so they were really excited to get a few young people on board. But that being said, that's from like a very technical standpoint of a guild, and like it's very structured and everything. But I know a lot of young people, I suppose through my work in fashion, but also just through being an artist and being young and meeting people. I know a few other weavers, and it's definitely, there's a lot more interest in handcrafts sort of resurfacing. It's just sort of, I've noticed that a lot of people don't really know where to begin or where to get information from, and they're kind of being oversold these very simplistic processes by people who are marketing it really well, but they're not actually educating people that deeply on the subject as far as they could go, if you know what I mean. And that's where I feel like where I'm trying to bring it a little bit more public and kind of try and connect the dots for people. And I get a lot of messages asking just really normal questions, the questions that I asked, and I just happened to know a community that I could ask. So it's been really nice actually being able to share that information with my younger community.
And have you ever thought, this is just putting out there, but have you ever thought about maybe setting something up that would create a more accessible platform for people who are interested in getting into this?
It's a difficult thing, I basically say, for instance, on my social media, I started this week on Instagram, on the TV, they have the IGTV thing. And I've just decided to start doing little 5-minute episodes talking about various, like whatever kind of comes to mind at the time, little snippets of fiber related, info and stories or what have you, because I thought maybe this is the way to start. I don't know, because it's never been done before. It's a very like old fashioned thing to bring into this modern world. And I know, like, I personally, like, I follow a lot of makers and doers, dyers, knitters, weavers, artists on social media, and they follow their own practices very well, and I find it very inspiring. But it can either range from being really, really quite technical to being very, very subjective to the artist's sort of personal journey. And both of those things are really nice, but I'd like to see something in the middle. And maybe I'm trying to do that, but I'm not really sure how to do it yet. So I'm just going to kind of wing it and see.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many amazing ideas kind of just start with those tinsy little baby steps, and you don't really know what you're doing. You're kind of feeling around in the dark, but when you find that like light switch, you're like, okay, I made a start and now I know where I'm going.
Yeah, and I also think this changes all the time as well. Like, you might think that one way is really good for a while, and then it might completely change later on. I guess you have to be ready for anything.
What material do you like working with the best? Like, what's your favorite?
I really like silk. It's got a lot of amazing qualities that are kind of contrast each other, like its strength, and it's very, very malleable, and I just like the way that it takes the light. So often I think artworks are based on light and how they kind of catch it, and the way that you perceive something, and basically the way our eyes work is how much light's coming in, right? So if something has a particular quality that can change as well, I find silk really luminous, so I really enjoy it for that reason. But I also really like wool because it's local and there's so many ways to change it around, and like depending on the way you spin it, wool can be really light and easy and great for babies' clothes, or it can be really dense and super duper warm. So I don't know, like, actually all fiber interests me. I just actually have to learn a lot more about the other ones. But so far I've been obsessed with wool and silk.
I mean, I love both when it comes to like clothing pieces, but I always find that when I wear wool, it itches so much. And
yeah,
I just kind of like avoid wearing it. But I don't know, have you found that there's something maybe that you can do to wool that takes away that like nagging itch?
I think it just depends on the weather, really. Like, it can be super warm or not, and maybe it's supposed to be hypoallergenic, but I think it just depends on the way it's been processed, as well. Because as I said, like, its qualities can change depending on how it's been processed into a garment. I also personally, I feel the same way as you do, so I like to wear wool blends.
What kind of came first? Your like the love for sustainability, or was it kind of a cataclysm of both, with like these artisanal approaches? And how do you, other than in your work, implement a sustainable approach in your lifestyle?
So I would definitely say hand making and artisanal like pursuits influenced my perspective on sustainability. I probably, like so many of us, wouldn't have really thought about the amount that we consume just from non-reusable things. My personal journey started, with like clothing consumption, because I've worked in fashion as a model for a long time. I'm surrounded by this industry. I know quite a lot about it now just from being around it. But then making it by hand, you start questioning, well, why is something so cheap on one hand or so expensive on another? What are the differences in quality? Where have they been made? And when you start asking those questions, it can become really confronting. But also when it happens organically like that, I don't even really know when it started, when I started thinking like that or not. I know it came after hand making, but it would have just been this slow seed of understanding and asking questions. And I guess I'm in the right industry to ask those questions. But you start realizing that people either overlook it or they get really passionate about it. And the more you talk, whether it's to someone who's passionate or not, the more you start making up your own mind. And I suppose that was the catalyst for me. And in my personal life, outside of work, basically avoiding I'm not totally there yet. I'm not a totally 100% plastic-free household, but we don't go to the supermarket to buy food. We go to the market because it's not packaged. We take bags everywhere. I mend everything. At the moment as well, I'm starting these mending workshops for the public, and we're teaching people how to basically have practical skills so they can fix their clothing. Because I feel like a lot of this kind of household domestic arts have kind of died out in the last generation, and a lot of people are really craving just these very simple knowledge. And so I kind of combine this practical elements with also a commentary on creativity, because I think as well a lot of people are really daunted by the idea of creating something out of nothing, because they think they have to be an artist to do that, and they might not feel like they are. But my whole message is like creativity is just problem solving. It just depends on what you're trying to solve. Creativity for an artist is them trying to communicate their idea, but creativity for a person who just ripped their jeans is, how do I fix this hole? So it's kind of trying to shift people's mentality and not be so scared of something new or something that they maybe have been conditioned into thinking isn't for them or isn't a reliable thing, or it's approachable. We are all here together. Just try. Because half the time, even if you're not good at it, the fact that you're there in the moment trying it means that you will think about it. And the seeding of the idea, much like how it's seeded for me with hand making and thinking about waste, it's so powerful. And it doesn't have to be immediate. It's just starting that idea will take you a long way. And once you start thinking like that, you can never go back.
Yeah, it's truly just taking that first step. What impact do you wish to make across all these platforms that you're working on with your work? And can you speak to how you feel you are good at bringing this message across?
Personally, I feel like the message is important to everyone, but in my own life, from what I've done so far with it, of making and doing, and people respond really well to the things that I've made. They ask me questions, they want to know more, they feel fascinated by how something is made. I see it when I display my work, I see it when people look at the photographs of it. And I don't think that that's just because they're really interested in my work. I think it's because the work brings to the foreground, almost kind of brings it into plain view of how something can be made. It makes you question it a little bit. And I think with that question in mind, you feel closer to it. So I think maybe the fact that I'm making and doing myself and testing my own work through that makes me a good advocate. But it also, even I hope that if I wasn't making the art, I would still be asking the questions. But overall, my message is very much about connectivity, creating a community, not being afraid to ask the questions, be amongst it, and learn something new. Because I found myself very often afraid of exactly those things and not really knowing why. And it's usually because I have no one to talk to about it. And when I realize that, I try and find someone I can talk to about it. And so I want to offer that to other people.
And going back to that time that you referenced earlier, in that time of fear and you weren't necessarily really open about what you wanted to achieve and the ideas that you had, do you remember a clear turning point where you took that first step to opening up?
Yeah, well, I guess it just built up into this feeling of overall fear and anxiety. And I was like, I'm not an anxious person. Why am I? And I really got to a point where I asked myself, like, why am I so anxious about this? To this point where I can't even talk about my work. I get so worked up about it. What is wrong with me? And that's when I realized, I was like, this isn't me. And it's the way that I've been building this up in my own mind. So that's been the first step for me. And now that I've learned that with that experience, I basically stick to that now. If I'm ever feeling anxiety about my work, I usually realize it's because I need to talk about it with somebody.
I always reference, it's really people enhancing people and just connection.
Yeah, very true.
And to close things off, I would love it if you could give an example of a time in your life where it was guts versus logic and you went with a gut. It could be a tinsy coincidence or one of those mind-boggling moments.
The first thing, I suppose, that comes to me is it's very a day-to-day thing. But years ago, about 5 years ago, I got a phone call at my mobile, and it was a number I didn't know. And I would never pick it up normally. And I picked it up on this day, and I was very cautious on the phone. And it was somebody I didn't know, but he was a friend of a friend. And he turned out to be my now music partner and also now my life partner. And at the time, it was funny because all of my logical instincts were like, what are you doing? Why are you talking to this person? Why are you sharing this? Why are you going to help him? That sounds strange to say that, but why are you putting yourself out there for him? Because he was asking me to do that from this conversation. But there was just something inside of myself that told me that this was a good thing to do, and it didn't matter if other people were telling me I was being strange or that normally I wouldn't do that. And all the logical things I sort of just didn't regard. And I just let it play out, and it's turned out that this person has absolutely changed my life for the better. So I suppose that's the best example that I can think of. This is Rachel Rutt, Guts and Glory, signing off.
This was This Fiber Journey with Rachel Rutt. Refer to the show notes to further get to know our guest. Share your thoughts and show us some love by subscribing or get in touch to be featured on the podcast. Released every other Monday. Thanks for lending us an ear. Passing on the mic.